Hello everyone, my name is Lowko and welcome to another StarCraft 2 game analysis. What I got for you today is a Zerg vs Protoss macro game that I played recently. And while I do think that I played pretty decently well, I think there is quite a bit of room for improvement as well. And that's exactly what the goal for this video is. I want to try and figure out first off what went well, but more importantly where my improvements in Zerg vs Protoss currently lie. Now this is a game that is played in Master 1, and before we really jump into the analysis, I want to give a shout out to SC2 Replay Stats, which is not only going to make it easier for us to analyze this game, but also because they decided to go ahead and sponsor today's video. If you're interested in analyzing your own games as well, you can sign up for a free account down below in the description of this video. Now I want to split this one up into 3 different segments. Obviously it's one video, but I want to split it up into 3 different segments. We're going to be looking at the early game, the mid game, and then also the late game. Now SC2 Replay Stats has determined that the early game is roughly the first 4 or so minutes. The mid game is going to be minute 4 to 8, and then everything after that is going to be the 8-minute mark. Obviously that's one of these things that is up to debate, but there are some really cool raw data points that I will show you in just a little bit that compares this replay and my performance in this game compared to the average Grandmaster game that has been played in recent times as well. Alrighty, so this is a Zerg vs Protoss where I decide to play pretty passively. I decide to not really take any unnecessary risks. I don't decide to go for any kind of hyper-aggressive pushes, and really what I'm doing is just simply sitting back while trying to macro up a big army to eventually overwhelm my opponent. And for those of you that watch the live stream, you know that I play a variety of builds. I like to go for really aggressive builds, I like to go for cheeses, I like to go for a variety of strategies, but usually playing macro is what I would like to consider at the very least my gold standard. So I've got my first overlords moving across the map right now as well. I've actually decided to go for a really quick third hatchery. This is something that I like doing from time to time. I know it's technically speaking not necessarily the most optimal choice, just because it's a little greedy. Obviously, you sort of put down that nexus, or rather that hatchery, before you even see their nexus. So it's a little bit greedy because my queens are much delayed, and with that my creep spread and my injects and all that as well. But it does allow you to start off very powerfully. Now let's figure out whether or not this is something that pays off. So the normal strategy for Zerg is to go hatch, gas, pool. Then you go for, obviously, Zerging speed, you pull 2 drones out of the gas, you go for 2 queens, and then sometimes in Zerg vs Protoss even a 3rd queen, sometimes even a 4th queen, and then you take your 3rd base. So you still take it early on, but you don't take it, you know, you don't take it quite as early as I decided to go for in this particular match. Now this is something that I've been doing a lot more as of late as well. The second overlord, so the very first one that I make, I've decided to send that one straight into the main base, which allows me to figure out what it is my opponent is going for. So here comes the very first adept. Now let's see if I do this a little bit of micro correctly. The adept decides to shade up towards the high ground. I have a handful of Zerglings out. Link speed will be finishing up here in just a little bit. And up to this point, I would say that it has been a pretty clean game. Obviously, you don't want to lose any workers unless, you know, your opponent is getting hyper aggressive. You really can't justify losing any workers here whatsoever. And while I did end up taking a little bit of damage, it didn't really bother me all too much. Right up to this point though, where once again the adepts decide to shade in and they get a single worker for their troubles. Now I have already started up the spore crawlers, and this is one of the easiest ways to improve in ZVP in case you're unfamiliar. Even if your opponent is not opening up Stargate, there's always the chance that your opponent is going to be throwing Dark Templar or whatever at your face. If you are anywhere below, I would say like top 50 Grandmaster, it's worth putting down a spore crawler or 2, or sometimes even 3, right around the 3-minute and 30-second mark. The reason for that is that you can get them out in time before your opponent can get really aggressive on your side of the map with, for example, these oracles. So I lost a single worker up to this point. I do end up killing one of my opponent's workers as well, but we have arrived now, well I guess almost, there we go, we have arrived now at the 4-minute mark, which is exactly when I'm starting up my lair. Alrighty, so here we are in SC2 Replay Stats. Now what I want to do here first is really zoom in on the first couple of minutes of the game. There are some really cool information screens right over here as well. I really like looking at the heat map, but this more or less shows us an average of the entire game. So you'll notice here, there's going to be some action somewhere on his side of the map a little while later as well. Regardless though, I really like looking right here at the guided improvement focus and more importantly the raw data points as well. Essentially what this does is that it looks at my league that I am in right now. So I am currently in Master 1 with Zerg, right around like 5.3k MMR or so. And what it does is that it compares my average replay, or this replay rather, to the average replay of a Grandmaster level player. So what that means is that it's going to show me how well I've performed in comparison to the average Grandmaster level player, which is really helpful. Now, obviously, Grandmaster is probably the league with the most skill level variety. I mean, the difference between like a top 5 GM and a top 200 GM is absolutely insane. For example, losing one worker here is already showing up as losing too many workers, which obviously isn't, you know, it is to be taken with a grain of salt. I found actually that the guided improvement focus is very, very helpful, in particular if you are somewhere between like, I would say like Bronze League up to like Platinum/Diamond League. I think you're gonna get a lot more value out of this screen because it's got a lot more data to compare you against as well. But regardless, I like looking at the raw data points. And there's one over here that I find very fascinating. So the first 4 minutes, right? I have played the first 4 minutes literally 10,000 times, like a lot more than that. And my average time over 30% free supply, it's a massive difference. Look at that. So I have got 42 seconds right here where I have over 30% in free supply, whereas the average Grandmaster level player only has about 12 seconds, meaning that I may very well be making my overlords a little bit too early and maybe a little bit too quickly. Obviously, being supply blocked is bad, but being oversupply doesn't really add any value either. Now, you can see here the value of creating that very quick third hatchery and delaying your queens and all that, and obviously it is a little bit risky, but you can notice here, I have produced 31 workers, whereas the average Grandmaster level player only produced 25 and a half. Everything here looks all right. I think the next 4 minutes are gonna show us a lot more interesting info. Alright, so we're at the point where I just now started up the lair. Now, up to this moment, as you may have noticed, I'm playing a little bit greedy, and it's probably one of the reasons why I have indeed got a lot more workers than the average GM. I have decided to delay both my Baneling Nest as well as the Roach Warren. This is something that I've been trying to do more, but let me try to explain to you as to why I decided to go for this for just a little bit. So the reason for that is that I've seen a lot of pro gamers skipping out a lot of their important tech structures as well, just simply because they've scouted out exactly what it is that the Protoss is going for up to this point in the game. So I know the timing of both his, and actually I do see the units here. I know the timing of both his Stargate, the timing of when the units arrived on my side of the map, as well as when he when he made his third base. Now, obviously, I didn't quite go back into the main base. So what I do want to point out, right, is that I probably should have made either Nematized Carapace, which is Overlord speed, to go back into the main base and see if I can delay these kind of tech structures. And by the way, right now that Lair is finished, I do start up my Hydra Den as well as the Baneling Nest. But I should have probably gone back around just to see if additional gateways went down. Now, at this point, obviously, that's not the case, but my opponent could have very well spent the minerals that he spent on creating economy for a third nexus on a whole bunch of gateways. Like, for example, if he added on like 6 gateways over here in the main and he would have pushed, I would have been stuck with Zerglings and then also only queens. So not only am I going for a really quick third base, which is already a little bit more greedy than you would anticipate, I've also decided to delay all of my tech, which, to be fair, does give you a pretty booming economy, and I haven't really lost all too much just yet. It looks like actually my opponent managed to sneak in and just pick off a few more workers once again. But there's no denying that I'm playing this a little bit more greedily than you absolutely would want to. Instead, I probably should have added on this Baneling Nest that I started creating here anyway, right around, say, I don't know, like 4 minutes at the very latest, right? That seems to be a pretty good time for it, just in case my opponent is following up his Stargate play with a bunch of like Zealots or maybe a bunch of Adepts. So I've got now also the Lurker Den coming in, and this is something that I've been experimenting quite a bit with as well. So there's really a couple of options that you have as a Zerg player. I've been going, in the recent week or so, I've been going for a lot of double Hydra Den play, where essentially you go double Hydra Den, and you make both upgrades at the same time, and then you do a really awkward Hydra push. Most of the time, with the recent changes to multiplayer, with the upgrades once again being split up and all that, I found that that a lot of players are playing a little bit more greedy than you would anticipate. Regardless, though, in this particular game, I decided to play a lot more standard, where I go for the lurker den a little bit quicker here as well. Now notice, I am starting to drop a couple of workers here and there, and it's actually already worked up to 7 here in total. My opponent has now also sent forward a couple of these adepts. He actually decides to cancel the shade from some of those and really start nibbling away at my workers once again. This is 8 workers. That's all been relatively minor, but there's no denying that I really shouldn't be losing this much. How could I have prevented these, in particular the oracles in the main base, from dealing this much damage? Well, first off, I think having, for example, one of my extra queens available in the main base would be very helpful. I've noticed a lot of Zerg players in recent times making 3 queens before even making the 3rd hatchery, like I already mentioned. You can use that queen not only to put down a bunch of creep tumors, but then also to go ahead and defend the main. For example, 1 queen over here and then 1 over there with the spore crawler in the middle of the mineral line probably would have saved me about 5 workers. Doesn't sound very significant, but you gotta keep in mind, workers mine for about 1 mineral a second. That's about 5 minerals a second that I am missing out on just by losing a couple of them. Ideally, I wanted them alive for the next like 10 minutes, right? Which would be about 300 minerals per minute that I am missing out on for every single minute remaining for the rest of this game. Now, obviously, it doesn't quite work out like that because units could still die. And obviously, I may have to add on additional workers and all that. But there's no denying that I am missing out on a lot of potential income. And the cost of 1 additional queen preventing 5 workers from dying is 100% worth it. Right? That obviously is worth it. There's a lot more value to that 1 queen, even besides just protecting the mineral line. So I think better queen positioning is one of the main things that I could have learned from here. Secondly, if I go back for just a little bit, right? Look, these adepts arrive on my side of the map. And I'm actually gonna go ahead and speed through the point once again where the adepts get in here. These adepts arrive on my side of the map. And while I kind of know that they are there and I see them right now, here's the thing. They get here with very minimal resistance. I sacrifice a bunch of Zerglings. I mean, how many have I lost at this point? I sacrificed 12 Zerglings here in total. I've killed 0 of these adepts. Is this the scenario that we want to be in? Because right at this point, I also started up 6 more workers as well as the lurker den. How could I have prevented this from happening? Well, first off, having more than 12 links out would be very helpful. But then secondly, also having that Baneling Nest out a little bit earlier or a Roach Warren a little bit earlier, just having more defensive capabilities would have made it a lot easier for me. And once again, this all adds up very quickly. So the adepts go into my mineral line. They don't kill a ton, but I don't really manage to kill a ton here myself either. And it all adds up very quickly to the point where I lost 10 workers. And I can already tell you that no matter what, SC2 replay stats is going to tell me that losing 10 workers is bad, right? You don't want to lose 10 workers. If you look at a pro game, at this scenario right now, your average GM player, there's no way that they would have lost 10 workers. And that's mostly just because I'm playing too greedy, I'm cutting too many corners, I need to make that extra queen a little bit faster, I need to get my Baneling Nest out a little bit faster, and I need to make sure that I'm roaming with at least 16 Zerglings a little bit earlier as well, likely right when I finish up my link speed. Right? When I finish up my link speed, I think I made about 12 links. I need to make sure that I keep them alive, and I need to make sure that I keep them for defensive purposes as well. Alright, so here's the next stage in this game. I've got 61 workers, but my opponent is currently most definitely ahead. I've got a pretty good setup here, all things considered, but it isn't perfect. It isn't quite exactly where we want it to be. So I'm trying to target fire down the Warp Prism there. I don't quite get it, but notice here, right? For the last couple of minutes or so, I haven't been able to drone anymore. So imagine if at this point I would have been at 61 or 71 drones instead, my economy would have been, I don't really want to do the math on it once again, but it's going to be significantly stronger than where it's at right now, and that would really allow me to deal with my opponent's army. And by the way, when the first adepts moved across the map just to backpedal a little bit, there was the chance that he had like 8 gateways available as well, right? I wouldn't have had anything to do with that, so I really need to be a lot more on point when it comes to that kind of gameplay. Regardless, we are now at the 8-minute mark right here. I just got my 4th base finished. I am just starting up my lurker play here as well. And apparently I've made now an extra hatchery. Interestingly enough, at the 4-minute mark, I started up the lair. And then apparently at the 8-minute mark, my lurker den just finished. That's pretty interesting. Alrighty, so I need to work on keeping my supply block time down. That's mostly because of that roaming phoenix. Fair enough. I need to work on spending my resources, spending my gas, as well as protecting my mineral lines. Now let's have a look at the raw data points. My workers produced, once again, right? It's significantly higher than the average Grandmaster League player. And you might say here, maybe that justifies the fact that I lost a bunch of workers as well. The thing is, this compares me to the average Grandmaster League player, meaning that this also includes a lot of cheese games where, you know, you're obviously either going up against your opponent playing really aggressive, or maybe you're playing really aggressive yourself. Worker production rate, apparently there is a gap during which I am producing too few workers. So while I'm producing more workers, I'm not producing them fast enough, meaning that I really need to be a lot more on point with my unit production cycles, really be focused on making sure that I keep on spending my larva. I've noticed that as well in a lot of the recent games. I'm just simply not spending my larva quickly enough. And here you can actually see that same issue once again popping up here with my unspent minerals and unspent Vespian. This is really an indication, like these right here, the average unspent minerals, as well as the worker production rate. This is really an indication that I am not spending my larva fast enough. So while I do have my larva available, and I am not really missing any queen injects if I'm not mistaken, I'm not really spending my larva quickly enough. So just by simply spending my money faster, I am going to be able to lower this gap between Master 1 and Grandmaster League, and the average Grandmaster League player, right? So say like a top 100 level player, significantly more. And it's not even that massive, but it does add up very quickly. Now, obviously, you may make the argument here that I am under a lot of pressure and it's difficult to pull this off, but there's no denying that it's very valuable information where it's showing me that I've got too much idle larva. And actually, this is one of the statistics I would love to see added to this. I've noticed this a few times in the past as well. I would love to see, for example, a idle larva button here for Zerg, so we could see the exact amount that I am averaging when it comes to idle larva compared to the average GM player as well. But regardless, my average army value is lower here as well. Once again, that's one we can take with a grain of salt. Now, one thing that I also want to have a look at here. My second hatchery was fast, my third hatchery was pretty quick here as well. However, I'm more interested in, for example, saturations here, and then the fourth hatchery time apparently was a little late. So while I did the first two pretty well, the third one that I produced was a little bit later, right? My fourth hatch was a little bit later, about a half minute or so. That does add up very quickly over time once again as well. My average time supply blocked also a little bit more than I ideally would want it to have. As far as my upgrades go, Nematized Carapace, I mean, it was started there, but definitely a little bit later than we would ideally want to see it. And a lot of these other upgrades are not quite relevant just yet. My spawning pool was a little late there as well because I did play rather greedy. Evolution chamber timing at the 4-minute and 49-second mark. I do think that's something worth pointing out here. I did start up the evolution chamber around the same time that I finished up the lair. I probably wanted to make this one a little bit, like, probably right around the same time as I started up the lair. So remember, 4 minutes is when I started up the lair roughly. It's actually showing me in real time here, I'm supposing, so it's a little bit different here. But regardless, it's still a good indication that apparently I am a little bit off there when it comes to the Evo chamber. I should be producing that a whole bunch earlier. I do think that that is important. Alrighty, and right now we have arrived at the later stages of this game, and really the point where I think I can make a lot of improvement here as well. I feel like the first 8 minutes of this game were decently played, other than the fact that I lost 10 workers. And I think we have successfully analyzed as to how I can prevent that from happening. And we've also, more importantly, successfully analyzed that I am having too much idle larvae here continuously. Right, look at that. You see how many idle larvae here are available continuously? If you compare that to like Dark, or for example Cero, or for example Sue, for example Scarlet, I mean, if you compare my idle larva compared to one of the top level players, I can guarantee you that they have significantly less larvae available at these moments in the game. And I'm also making a bit of an awkward push now with these Hydras and Lurkers. I kind of want to do something with them, but then I'm being hesitant about it and I once again decide to back off. I think if I want to be aggressive here with my army, I should be doing so with Zerglings and Banelings instead. Now my opponent is currently moving out on the map. I do find a little bit of value here with some Banelings as well, and I do think that Lynx is actually doing a pretty good job here at just simply sitting back. But here's where I get a little bit worried, and this is one of the things that I've been struggling with over the last couple of years. Here's where I'm getting a little bit worried. My opponent has been allowed to be sitting back this entire game, right? I mean, he has killed 10 workers here in total. I've killed 1 worker of his. That's not great. But allowing a Protoss to just sort of do whatever they want, it does mean that I could potentially go up against someone who is going for a fleet beacon. And in this game, I purposefully decide that I kind of want my opponent to have that option, but I'm also not really, positioning my army in a way where I'm really showing that, right? Like, why are my Lurkers all the way out on the map? There's really very little reason for this. It shows a level of indecisiveness right here from me, because if I want to be aggressive, it makes sense that my Lurkers are out on the map. However, if I allow my opponent to play that fleet beacon style, and if I'm not too worried about facing that kind of composition, I would have been able to once again prevent a bunch of workers from dying, because for example, I could have Lurkers in my main base. For example, I could have Lurkers over at my 3rd. For example, I could have Lurkers defending my 4th hatchery as well. Instead, I'm kind of out on the map, sitting at an awkward position, just because I know that in a lot of my past games, I've lost because my opponent managed to go up to mass carriers and then I just sort of rolled over and died. And once again, it's not significant, but it's one of those things that can easily go in their favor if you're not paying attention. So basically what I'm trying to say, right, is that I have to make sure that I am either playing defensive or I'm playing aggressive, but a middle of the road option is really not there. So I am now at Hive Tech. I'm getting myself my digging claws upgrade, my advanced talents upgrade here as well. That will allow me to burrow my Lurkers much faster. But already I'm giving my opponent a lot of wiggle room. So even though I have in mind right now that there's a good chance my opponent is going for Stargate units, I feel like one of the things that is really thoroughly lacking at this point is continued scouting. Remember the second Overlord that I sent into my opponent's main base right at the beginning? That's really where my scouting ended. Now right now I am indeed dealing with a lot of other things here as well, but there's no denying that I should have had, for example, an Overseer roaming the map to figure out what's up, or for example, a Dropper Lord going into my opponent's main base, not only to deal damage, but also to scout out what it is that I am going up against. Because right now I'm getting up my Spire, I'm sort of thinking, hey, there's a chance that my opponent could be going for a carrier switch, maybe my opponent could be going for a mothership, but really at this point I am mostly in the dark when it comes to that kind of shenanigans. So I think I need to be a lot more active here when it comes to scouting. For example, by creating the rule that I need to go for a Dropper Lord right around the time that my opponent is going for this. And this is one of the things, once again, a lot of pros have been doing recently. They go for example, Hydra drops right when they have a whole bunch of Hydras and the game has arrived at this like stalemate scenario where they just simply drop off the Hydras in the main base and they deal a bunch of damage, but more importantly, they keep the Protoss back, and also you can scout out what it is you're going up against. So I think that's another one of the main points of contest that I can really make right now, because I'm kind of awkwardly sitting back here. I want to move forward with a bunch of my Lurkers. Like, what am I doing here? Like, this is just weird. This doesn't make any sense. What do I even think of achieving here? My entire army was near the top right-hand corner of the map. I'm baiting my opponent out right now, and I do successfly do that. But that's mostly me relying on my opponent making a mistake rather than me making a good play, if that makes any sense. That's just, that's not something, you really want to do. And obviously, I'm sounding very critical here. I'm usually very critical when it comes to my own play. The thing is that I see so many things that I can be improving upon. Right? Now here's a good trait. You see that? That actually justifies this entire move. And I just want to emphasize this once again. So I try to bait my opponent towards the high ground, and I do so successfully. Trying to, rely on my opponent making an error, which is just a really silly thing to do. This is probably one of the biggest errors that my opponent makes right here. See all these important tech units, in particular the High Templar and the Archon and then the Immortals as well. They should not be going down. They are the kind of units that you want to keep alive for as long as possible. And while the Mothership does remain here, I end up cleaning up a lot of his tech structures. And at this point, I establish a pretty solid lead at this game. But there's no denying, right, that the only reason why I established that lead was not because I made such an insane move. It's because I accidentally overextended with my Hydras, and then I didn't realize my army was in the top right-hand corner. I was pushing forward with my lurkers, and then I pushed back. My opponent decided to chase it down because he thought he could, could handle that army, and then I got a little bit lucky with the way that he microed. That's not really the way you want to obtain victories, and not the way that you're gonna obtain victories in Grandmaster League, right? That's just not a very reliable way of playing. Instead, I think I should have been a lot more decisive here with both my unit positioning, my attacking moves right here, as well as, of course, my scouting, because I really feel like that is missing. Look at this, right? I'm getting my Greater Spire right now, assuming my opponent is still going to be sitting back at a ground-focused army, whereas already we see carriers on the production tab. I mean, the thing is about carriers, the moment where you decide to go carriers and the moment where carriers actually come out, about like 3 minutes pass. Right? It's kind of like lurkers, right? It took like 4 minutes for me to finish up my lurkers and me going up to a lair, right? I should really be aware right now of the fact that my opponent has got the option to go for carriers, because at this point, I mean, I've been scouting out what he's going for. I see that he's warping in High Templar, but I'm really not being very active about this whatsoever. I think if I would have known that my opponent is going for carriers, here's what I could have done, right? Right at this point. The thing about carriers is that usually Protoss doesn't want to move out until they have at least like 6 or so of them. I could have spent a lot of time here building up to, for example, 90 workers, making a whole bunch of spore crawlers, just being aware of what my opponent is doing, and I can still do these cute little run-bys here, which are nice, and right now I finally get a glance of the carriers, but I should really have been aware of this so much sooner, because right now I'm trying to catch up in my anti-air, right? Look at this, I'm creating 9 corruptors here all at once, and I decide to go for a bit of a push here as well to try and force my opponent to stay back, and maybe, you know, hope that my opponent's very first carrier just came out. But it's all a little bit awkward and not quite as reliable as we want it to be. So right now I move up towards this high ground, and this happens to me a lot in the late game. I move up towards this high ground and I don't know what it is my opponent has really got, and I feel like that is one of the things that I can improve upon. Now, wonderful move here by my opponent. He sees I'm going for the move out, and he immediately sends out a couple of Dark Templar as well as Zealots to move in there. So say for example that I was committing a lot more aggressively there to trying to defeat my opponent's 5th base. I would have probably lost an entire base there in the process as well. But this is what the lurkers are so very good at, right? I really have no particular reason not to have lurkers out on the map there, and maybe have them patrolling like 1 or 2 bases, or I guess just burrow at 1 or 2 bases and just really allow them to take control of that space, have like for example an overseer in surveillance mode so I can't accidentally move it either, and just simply prevent myself from losing a lot of this stuff, all the while I'm building up that bigger army, right? I think that would have been a much more reliable choice, whereas I am indeed in a pretty good economical position here, and I feel like I've done a decent job so far playing this game. There's no denying that I could have done a lot more, and I think I could have played this a lot better as well. It's kind of funny, when you reach a certain level in StarCraft 2, for example, when you start off in Silver League and then you get promoted to like Platinum, you think you are playing extremely well. And I think that's the time where you feel like you are strongest at StarCraft. As soon as you reach Master League though, and I've heard a lot of people say this, as soon as you reach Master League, while technically speaking significantly higher up on the ladder than Platinum, you realize how much work you still have to do and how much better some other players are, right? Because you think you're playing really well in some leagues, and then you realize, well, you know what? My opponents are pretty freaking amazing right now. Look, here as well, look at this. I'm sending an all army hotkey to the top right-hand corner to defend against a few of these units. This is just absurd, absolutely unnecessary. Why are the corruptors in that direction as well? I mean, I managed to clean it up, right? But once again, mostly because my opponent is not pulling out in time and he's just sort of letting them sacrifice themselves. And look, then right when he realizes, hey, wait a second, the corruptors are on the other side of the map, the High Templar move forward, the carriers move forward here as well, and I am caught with my pens down once again, whereas I could have had this high ground set up very nicely with like 20 spore crawlers, right? And just simply prevented my opponent from ever getting to this scenario in the first place. Now, luckily for me, I've had that very superior economy of 80 plus Harvesters here for a while already. I still have a huge amount of units reinforcing here as well. And luckily for me, I've also established a very strong army here, and my opponent is slowly mining low on a lot of these bases that he's had. And finally, I start to get some spore crawlers, but that's mostly just for style points, I suppose, making it look like I'm much better than I am. And I do indeed obtain the victory here, but I think there was a lot of room for improvement, both in the the early game, as well as, of course, the middle to later stages as well. Now let's have a look at what SC2 replay stats has to say about my late game. Now, once again, right, we do have to take some of these with a bit of a grain of salt, just because, of course, a lot of games will end by 8 minutes, and then some of them go all the way up to like an hour. It's important that you take these all with a little bit of thought behind it as well. But there's no denying, like, look at that, right? Worker production rate, it's the gap in between me making workers is just insane in comparison to the average Grandmaster League player. Plus, once again, I've got an average unspent Vespian, which for Zerg is the one starving resource that you really need in the later stages, that is higher than the average Grandmaster League player, whereas I had an army that should be a lot more reliant on it. I mean, how much better would my late game army have been if I, for example, mixed in a few Vipers as well? My Great Aspire, look at this, right? This is also something very fascinating in my opinion. I did go for the lurker play, of course, and that's something important to keep in mind, but it doesn't justify me delaying my Spire by almost 2 minutes. Right, my Great Aspire, that is, by almost 2 minutes. It doesn't make sense in particular considering I started up the Hive about a minute earlier than the average GM player, but then my Great Aspire not until minutes later. That is all a little bit awkward, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense in the grand scheme of things. I think I need to be a lot more decisive with my decision making, in particular when it comes to playing against that Skytos based army. I don't know if I really need to be all too scared about these kind of moments. Anyway, so once again, let's relive the final moment right here where we had that big engagement on my opponent's side of the map. I had 17 Corruptors at this point, as well as 7 Hydralisk. Really not too crazy. My opponent, however, he had only 7 carriers, but 54 Interceptors, which is kind of crazy. I think, though, right, if we go back to the moment where my opponent lost the High Templar, which I think is right over here. So he has got 4 High Templar, 8 High Templar, 10 High Templar. I'm not entirely sure where that moment was where my opponent lost the majority. Oh, right here. Right, look at that. This is where my opponent had 9 High Templar, and then he all of a sudden had 0 a little while later, right? Imagine if my opponent would have saved, for example, 2 of the 3 Archon here by not being baited up towards the higher ground. And also say, for example, 5 of the High Templar. And I think he could have saved a lot more. Imagine if 2 Archons were added to the fight right over here, and then like an additional bunch of High Templar, or maybe he could have spent that gas on like another 2 or 3 carriers. Right? Imagine that. I think that I got a little bit lucky with that initial bait towards the high ground where my opponent overextended. But mostly that's just him making a mistake and me not playing a very reliable game there whatsoever. So I do feel like I played well in this game, and I do feel like I did a pretty decent job trying my very best to play a solid game. But I feel like my main improvements are the following. First off, I should be a lot more on point with my build order. I mean, my build order wasn't terrible, but I really should not be skipping out the 3rd queen so very late. I mean, I made it there eventually, but I lost 10 drones to like a very small amount of army from my opponent. I think having better queen positioning and just simply having them at the correct timing is going to be a good choice. Secondly, I need to make sure that I do not delay my Bailing Nest nearly as much, or either a Bailing Nest or a Roach Warren, both would do, but I need to make sure that I don't, delay like both of them until much later, because it's just so very risky, just in case my opponent goes for additional gateways. Even when he makes a 3rd base, I could have actually lost right then and there. And then I feel like I played the mid game pretty decently well, but in the late game, I need to be a lot more decisive with my army positioning in particular. So notice that I had my lurkers out on a map while playing a defensive game. That doesn't make any sense. Right? Warp prisms and pylons and whatnot, they can warp in so many units that having the lurkers defending my bases, and I mean, if there's any unit good at defending bases, it's the lurker, having them close to my base would make a lot more sense. I think I have to make sure that I am playing a lot more decisive against Skytos as well. And one of the reasons why I think I am usually a little bit scared, like quote-unquote scared, when facing against Skytos is primarily because of the fact that I have lost so many games against that kind of army, but more importantly also because I don't see it coming in time. So being more scouting focused right around the time that I hit my own hive is going to be important, so I can see when he is making the transition towards the late Skytles based army, and then I have more time to respond, for example to get my spore crawlers up, to for example get my vipers out, to for example make a lot more drones as well, because I know he's going to be sitting back for a while longer. So a lot of room for improvement in a game that I won. Once again, if you're interested in giving SC2 replay stats a try as well, it's free. I'll post a link to it down below in the description of this video. Make sure to sign up so you can register for your own account as well, because there's a lot of very valuable data that will just simply allow you to become a better StarCraft 2 player, right? And who doesn't want to become a better player in the greatest game of all time? But for now, I want to thank you for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile, alright? And I will see you in the next one.